The purchasing power of British workers has collapsed in the last year. Food prices are rising at almost 4 times the rate of wages. But while the cost of living crisis makes food, goods and services more expensive for everyone, you can walk down any British high street and find companies that are doing very well for themselves.
Inflation has gripped our economy, and while politicians portray it as a single number, it is more diffuse. Like a pandemic, it arrives in waves as new types develop. The first wave was caused by the pandemic, the second by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, a third wave of inflation has arrived, and this time, the force driving prices upwards is one many economists find difficult to model: greed.
Tesco's made £2.6 billion in adjusted operating profit in the last financial year. That's £1 billion more than they made in 2018. And their operating margin beat their record for the last 5 years. Starbucks' operating margin has risen to 19.1%. McDonald's profits per share rose by 16% last year, taking their operating margin to 45%. Krispy Kreme's first quarter profits are up 12% year on year. Boots' profits tripled in the last financial year, and their CEO's pay more than doubled to £3.8 million. Here at HSBC, their net interest income has gone up by 38% compared to last year, earning them an extra $2.5 billion from the difference between more expensive loans and worse savings accounts. I'm here to speak to Angela Eagle MP, who sits on the Treasury Select Committee, about why this isn't just unfair, it could lead us into a recession. Angela.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Angela, you recently spoke to the Governor of Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, about whether profit push inflation was occurring in the economy and whether companies were getting more price rises than they needed out of already stretched consumers. He described it as rebuilding margins. And so there wasn't really a lot of, greedflation, as it's often called, going on. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what's going on in the economy?
I mean, in my Wallasey constituency, 38% of people have said that they're worried about being able to have a meal during the day and having to miss a meal because they can't afford food. 3 million people took emergency food supplies in the last year. So this is a huge time of stress and worry for many, many millions of people. And when we look at what the corporations are doing, what the supermarkets are doing, what the banks are doing, you actually see increased profit margins, not returning profit margins to what they were in 2018 or 19, but actually doubling and trebling in some cases. I thought the governor was being incredibly generous to companies when he described what's been happening recently as rebuilding margins.
A company like Tesco, for example, well, their profits are half what they were the previous year, but they're still pretty healthy. They're making hundreds of millions of pounds in profit. They've bought back £1.8 billion of their own shares since late 2021. They might say, well, we've taken a big hit, but they're still doing very well for themselves, aren't they?
Their profit margin, 4%, is very high for the grocery industry. £2.3 billion in the last financial year, which is double what it was before the pandemic. So actually, I don't think that is rebuilding profit margins. It's actually taking far more money, I would say profiteering, by putting prices up at a time when they know that people will be confused about whether it's other forces that are causing the price rises and then blaming it on world commodity prices. Well, world commodity prices are now plummeting, but prices aren't. World energy prices are now plummeting, but prices aren't.
And it's not just that's unfair, is it? It's not something that consumers in your constituency can look at and say, well, I don't like the prices that Tesco is charging, I'll go elsewhere.
No, because they're high everywhere else. Food inflation is nearly 20%. And if you look at actually what inflation is for necessities like bread and milk, wheat, beans, pasta, That's all much higher than 20%.
One other area that is particularly relevant to the health of the economy, aside from obviously the crisis in the affordability of food, is the banking sector, right? And you've also, in the Treasury Select Committee, had the CEOs of major high street banks in to ask them about the difference between the savings rates that they're giving to people who do have savings and the amount that they're charging their debtors, because one changes very quickly and one of those numbers changes slowly or not at all.
Every member of the Treasury Select Committee has been struck by the difference in speed with which those who borrow from banks, they may have a mortgage, they may owe money to the bank, their interest rates go up virtually the same afternoon as the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee makes its announcements, and it's gone up 12 times in the last year and a bit. But those who actually look to earn a little bit of income because they've got savings in the banks, they don't see their rates of interest increased at all, if so very, very slowly. And if they want to get a better interest rate, it's quite often the case that they actually have to physically ship their money into a different product, which is quite difficult to do. So what's happening here is that banks are not passing on the benefit of the interest rate rise to savers. And the problem with that for the economy is that the whole idea of having an interest rate rise is to try to get people to save a little bit more and be rewarded for it, take a little bit of demand out of the economy gradually so that you can equalise some of the issues and maybe avoid a recession, but get some more balance. The banks keep all of it on the savings side. That mechanism, which is the only real mechanism the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee has to do its macroeconomic policy, doesn't work. And so what's happening is that those who ought to be getting a benefit from saving and be incentivised to save a bit more aren't getting benefits, going straight into bank profits. And yet those who owe the bank money are being charged more straight away. If you then look at the amount of profits that banks are making in that sort of profit interest rate area, you'll see there's been huge increases in it.
Yeah.
And so despite their protestations to the committee, where they said there was absolutely nothing wrong, the fact is, if you look closely at their balance sheets, they are profiting massively.
In some cases, that's been well over 40%, the change in the amount they've made from that
I think for NatWest, over 40% increase in that profit, and it'll be similar for other banks. What they're doing is actually making that rate of interest change as a tool for monetary policy much less effective. And that implies, with all else the same, that you need higher rates of interest to get the effect that you would have had if they'd have passed that issue back on to savers more effectively. So that means in a situation where the bank is trying to cool the economy, it has to go to a higher rate of interest to achieve what it could have achieved a few years back on a lower rate. And that increases the chances of a recession. It certainly puts a lot more pressure on those who are borrowers and those who don't have that spare amount of savings.
And that's the key point, isn't it? That yes, this is unfair. Yes, this is a terrible thing that's making people go hungry. It means that people are getting less money for their savings, paying more for debt. But at the end of it all is also this fact that means the Bank of England will have to do more. They have to throw more cold water on the economy. And every time it does that, it increases the risk of a recession.
You've got to ask whether the way that this mechanism is now working is making the best use of money, the money in our economy, in a macroeconomic sense, to reinvest it in things that are productive. And when you find out what the banks and those who are making profits are actually doing with that money, you realise that they are buying back their own shares. They're not reinvesting in new infrastructure. They're not doing things that make their businesses more efficient and more productive. And the real economy is suffering as a result of it. Now, that might be some of the explanation for the absolutely appalling and abysmal productivity rate that the UK economy has managed to achieve since Brexit, which has basically been static.
who can fix this? The Treasury Select Committee, you can draw attention to it, you can
Yes.
call people in
I'm
and
not
ask
sure
them
we can
questions.
fix it as a-
You do a great job of that.
Yeah.
But who else is there? Some people say the Competition and Markets Authority need to get involved and do an investigation of company profits across the board. But
I mean, I'm
Well,
in favour of Competition and Markets Authority and the regulators doing their job. I would prefer them to do their job faster. I would look to the government and the Treasury to do something about it. I'd also like the Governor of the Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee to pay a bit more attention to the profit push inflation that we're seeing getting in the system, and start drawing attention to it and shaming people over it.
what steps can the government itself take to address greedflation?
First of all, start looking and producing papers about it, and draw attention to what people's profits are, what they're doing, what's happening with either shrinkflation or greedflation. And we need to have the media, I think, also pay much more attention to it, so that corporate bosses know that they cannot get away without some public scrutiny if they continue to behave in this manner.
Are wages the problem?
No, wages aren't clearly not the problem. The British workforce is in the second year of a huge real-term squeeze in the value of the income that's being earned. Some people are much worse than others. Even those that have managed to get 5 or 6% are actually, in real terms, earning less than they did last year and a lot less than they did the year before. And that comes after 13 years, certainly in the public sector, of pay freezes and 1% increases. So in some cases, our public sector workers who got us through the pandemic by going to work and putting their lives on the line are 20% worse off in real terms than they were at the start of the period of Conservative rule. So I think it's a bit much for the Governor of the Bank of England or anyone else to lecture workers about being the cause of inflation.
Is this a new political problem?
It's not a new political problem. We have been in similar situations in Western democracies before, where the economy has failed quite badly and even the basics aren't being provided. I think if you think about President Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression in the States, he actively called out the greed of the big corporations who were profiteering on the back of the calamities that happened after the stock market crash in 1929. I think it's about time we had some politicians that called out their successors in the 2020s.
Angela Eagle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The rise of inflation posed a challenge to the economies of the US, UK and Europe. Who should pay? Our answer has exposed us, for all our social progress, as participants in a grasping and predatory system. In passing the bill on to those who can least afford it, our society shows itself at its worst.